Hello everyone, Loremaster Sotek here, and we're back with some Ogre Kingdoms Q&A. Hope you're all doing well. I apologize I haven't been around a ton this week. Things have been super duper busy with the speedrun contest. I've had a lot of people sending in entries, and we've had a couple of kerfluffles, for lack of a better term. And it's been a lot of fun. Thankfully, we're wrapping it up today. I'm really glad that I decided to make it only like about a week long and not too much longer than that, because whew, it's been an interesting experiment. But I'm really glad I did it, and I hope everyone's looking forward to us announcing the winners and all that stuff, which we'll do that tomorrow. But in any event, with that calming down and me finally having a little bit of time, I really want to get back to just getting out some lore content on the channel, especially some other projects that I'd really like, lore projects that I'd really like to see come to fruition. So we'll kind of be pumping the brakes on Total War stuff for a little while and focusing just exclusively on lore for a bit, which I hope is okay. But you know, we'll unless something like hits the fan or something gets announced randomly. But I think with the Paunch and the Warden now way past us, and with this event wrapping up, we'll have some free time to get back to the true core and heart of the channel. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into today's questions. Our first question comes from Rapton Soul, and he asks, how do Gnoblars set up shantytowns? Gnoblars are the masters when it comes to collecting and amassing scrap. Especially then taking said scrap and making up these concerningly intricate but unstable structures, whether it be crude war machines and platforms that they will attach onto like Rhinox, which Rhinox are like a scrap launcher is literally one of the war machines used by the Ogre Kingdoms, and it's literally just a bunch of Gnoblars got together and they took one of the younger Rhinoxes in a tribe and basically strapped a bunch of random garbage to it and made a functioning catapult out of it that not only works and is stable despite the fact that it has like a big angry Rhinox pulling it around and charging into combat with it, but instead of shooting like boulders or something, the Gnoblars will just take random stuff from enemies that the Ogres have defeated, because the Ogres don't care about anything too small for themselves. So if they defeat like a big army of the Warriors of Chaos, they don't really care about any of their armor or their weapons or any of that stuff, but the Gnoblars do. So the Gnoblars will gather up all of like the helmets and shields and swords and axes and spears and all this stuff that the Ogres don't want, and they use that to build things, and they also use it as munitions for their scrap launcher catapults. So they tend to have a lot of stuff to work with, just because a lot of people tend to either pass through Ogre territory, or the Ogres are constantly fighting against various invasive groups like Greenskins or Chaos Dwarves or Warriors of Chaos or whatever. So they have tons of stuff to work with, and granted, most Gnoblars live like the place where you actually find legit shantytowns tend to be beneath, south of the Mountains of Morn, in a place called the, oh my gosh, I can't remember what it's called, Gnoblar Country, which is in Total War right now, actually. That's what Pig Barter is. And those are literally places down in the, like, the foothills and almost swamps that are closer to the ocean and have a lot more base materials to work with, especially like trees and other stuff like that. And Gnoblars, they just kind of throw crap together until it starts to stand up. Really easy to knock over and get out of the way, but Gnoblars are surprisingly, I mean, all greenskins like to just build random garbage, but Gnoblars do seem to have a particular knack for it, even compared to their cousin species. That being said, it would be very ill-advised to trust the structural integrity of a Gnoblar's efforts. Like, if you ever visited a Gnoblar shantytown, you would not want to walk across the platforms if you weigh more than a Gnoblar. Next up, Bjorn Liljedal. Sorry if I butchered that. Do ogres prefer being paid in food or gold as mercenaries? That depends on the ogres in question. All ogres will accept food, full stop. But most of them will accept gold nowadays, thanks to the crude but effective education program that Greece's Goldtooth basically orchestrated to teach all of the ogre kingdoms the value of gold so that it would be recognized as equivalent to red meat. Just because for a long time it wasn't. You know, certain ogre tribes found it valuable, others thought it was just stupid shiny stuff. But Greases really wanted to consolidate his power and that of the Goldtooth tribe, and the best way for him to make himself even more powerful than just by brutalizing people was to essentially set up an economy where he held all the cards, which revolves around gold. So that worked out really well for him. Legend of Cretaceous. Let's see, one question here, we already answered that. But you have another question, or two questions here. Do the ogres have any type of farming or agriculture? Or does all their food come from raiding and killing beasts? If so, is the depletion of game what forces them to be nomadic? So, no, ogres do not have any sense of farming or agriculture. They don't live in a place where it's viable, and they've never been good at it. Yes, all of their food comes from raiding and killing things, especially monsters and beasts. And yes, depletion of resources is what causes them to move. So they are hunters. That is like their whole thing, is traveling around and killing and eating stuff. And eventually it has gotten to the point in most of the places where they live where they start to expand enough that it's no longer sustainable for them to stay there. So they'll continue to move on. That happens very, very frequently with ogres. And then you asked a bonus question. Many races in the old world brew their own alcohol. Men, elves, dwarves, even greenskins. Do ogres have a unique drink that they make? The butchers and slaughtermasters of the tribes are not known, to my knowledge, of making any kind of alcohol. I don't think ogres have a concept of how to create it due to lack of the materials. That being said, there is a tribe that we've talked about in the past called the Feastmaster tribe, which has like a massive amount of halflings as part of their tribe, and they're known for having the best dosh, you know, the best food. So I imagine if you were to go to the Feastmaster tribe, they've cobbled something together, but it's probably really strong and not very tasty. Next up, Viggy the GM. Do ogres in the Empire share a similar status to halflings? How do they fit in legally and culturally? Ogres tend to virtually always be bodyguards that are working for only the wealthiest and most elite members of Imperial society, as only well-off merchants or significant political figures could afford to feed an ogre or manage their fees for any length of time. You know, they're the only ones that could afford to keep an ogre around. That being said, their legal status tends to... Ogres are, I would say, tend to be considered under a might makes right policy, where if the imperial authority in question has the ability to deal with an ogre, then they will enforce their laws on that ogre, but most of the time they don't, or it's just not worth the effort. So as long as the ogre is not trying to kill and eat people, or isn't like causing big fights or property damage, then they're going to leave it alone. Ogres are pretty good about behaving. They can be like a little gross and stuff, but it's nothing insane that the Empire hasn't seen with like filthy, you know, humans before. So, but their legal status tends to revolve a lot around who they work for. So if you have an ogre that's working for the local Burgermeister, or he works for like a judge, then he is going to have substantial authority, or like his status is going to be very, very high up. And like a man-eater who has various badges of imperial recognition from like performing in the army is going to get a lot more respect or leeway than like a random half-naked one wandering around from town to town. Culturally, ogres are very much seen as just big, dumb, vaguely lazy brutes who are best left alone. They can cause a big stir and a lot of fear, especially if they show up somewhere very rural or in a place where people just haven't seen an ogre in a long time, or maybe have never seen one before. I mean, there are some places that will try and kill them on sight because they think they're monsters or they've had a bad experience with ogres in the past. But for the most part, I would not say they share the same benefits as halflings. You know, halflings are recognized as imperial citizens. Ogres do not have that. However, they're kind of so strong and scary that it would take quite a bit for people to feel really good about trying to mess with them or infringe upon them doing just whatever they want. But most of them have the fortune to work for important people, or at least be recognized as a useful asset for important people. Sean McGee, have ogres ever offered their... Yes. We've already answered this. Yes. Drunk Monk, have the ogres ever sided with the forces of order? Empire/dwarves fighting against chaos, or do they hate those factions and would rather fight chaos alone? We've talked about this a fair amount, but just to re-hit the point hard of that, ogres will join anyone depending on the circumstances. Like, a very famous case is during the Great War against Chaos, when Azavar Kul invaded, and it was one of the greatest threats to the world that Chaos had managed to manifest in thousands of years. And they started smashing their way through Kislev and were eventually defeated at the gates of Kislev itself. It is noted historically that both sides, so the combined forces of order, which were made up of the dwarves, literally a handful of high elves, the Kislevites, and Empire soldiers, also had like a massive contingent of ogres with them. But so did the Warriors of Chaos, and not like legit Chaos ogres. Like, these are just ogres that joined up with the Chaos side. So so you had them on both sides. There were some ogres who were very much just wanting to revel in the destruction and being able to do and eat whatever they wanted, or they thought that Chaos was going to win, so they sided up with Chaos. And there were many other ogres who were genuinely enraged that Chaos was threatening their way of life, that Chaos was attacking their allies, or attacking, in a more simplistic term, like their food source and stuff. So many of these ogres who had steady lives living in the Empire or Kislev and stuff, they immediately signed up and were on the front lines. And these groups even clashed with one another with like no holds taken. Ogres, they'll fight for anybody. It just depends on how they think the situation would best benefit them. So hopefully that answers that. Raven559. Have any ogres crafted famous items, or do they get everything from the Chaos Dwarves? So, there are a number of items that are famously created or made. Ogres have a surprising amount of items that they craft. And most, if not all of them, are essentially things that are... Basically, they're like artifacts that imbue some power of the Great Maw. For instance, a really, really famous item that's difficult to get, but it's worth it if you can get it, is called a rock eye. And what a rock eye is you literally have to journey all the way to the Great Maw itself, to the physical location of the Great Maw. And when you're there, you can basically perform a sacrifice where you cut out one of your own eyeballs and throw it into the Great Maw, and then you pick up one of the pebbles or rocks around it and basically hammer it in place. And it allows that ogre to essentially see more than just basic reality. Like, they can kind of see the... let's see, where's my other book? They can kind of see, like, the winds of magic and other hidden things that they should not be able to see through mundane means. And the only reason I'm getting this out is to double check one thing I want to talk about, because there is one item that's super duper famous we're talking about. So, yeah, it literally allows them to see things that would be hidden. So they can, like, see assassins or people hiding through literally magical means. Some other famous ones, there's the Rune Maw, which the Rune Maw is literally a bunch of butchers have taken a large collection of magic or runic items taken from dwarves that have been killed. And they took all these different runic items that have had various functions, and basically they basically created a banner that's just like all these different runic pieces of equipment from the dwarves stolen in battle, covered with symbology of the Great Maw and stuff. And by just kind of forcing it together, it caused this weird situation where all of the magic contained within the runic items has this, like, they kind of feed into each other, and it creates this loop of energy that, when unleashed, by using the magic and the power of the Great Maw, they were able to make this Rune Maw, which literally can, like, burp out a force of a kind of a shockwave in the winds of magic that disrupts them entirely. And by doing this, it will literally cause spells to bounce. So like a wizard would fling a fireball or an amber spear or something at them, it could be any spell. It could be a purple sun or a debuff or whatever. But this spell would come at it, and just by having magic directed at it, the Rune Maw burps, for lack of a better term, and this shockwave redirects it onto something else. Some other particularly famous ones that are worth mentioning are Hell Hearts. Hell Hearts are very, very famous, or infamous, I'll say, items in tabletop, but a Hell Heart is essentially if a butcher or slaughtermaster is one of the most desired pieces of meat they can get their hands on, is the heart of a chaos sorcerer who has been so mutated that he's become a chaos spawn. If they manage to get their hands on one of these things, it literally allows them to, by devouring that heart, they can belch this horrifying whirlwind of disrupted dark magic that, when it impacts, like, not only is it super horrifying to witness, but if a wizard is nearby, it will ruin a wizard, because it basically makes any wizard that's standing too close, which too close is a surprisingly large area, they're guaranteed to miscast. Like, their own magic, because there's all this swirling insanity of this dark magic, when they try and cast, all of their magic just spirals out of control into a complete mess. Probably my favorite is a horrifying, genuinely horrifying piece of armor, a gut plate, called the Great Maw. And the big thing about this is it is essentially a gut plate, so big armor piece for an ogre's stomach that has been blessed by so many generations of ogre butchers that it has become something pretty horrifying. And literally what it does is it has a big set of iron jaws to give it the look of like a giant mouth. But what you don't realize is if you get too close to an ogre who's wearing it, these jaws can literally come alive and like lean out to eat you. And you don't go into the ogre's stomach. Oh no, it's much worse than that. If the ogre's magical gut plate eats you, your entire essence / your body gets teleported into the actual Great Maw to be devoured, which I could literally not imagine many things worse than that. Pretty horrible way to die, and the Great Maw is so pleased by that its energies will like cause the ogre who's wearing it, like all of his wounds will start to knit together and stuff. So he basically heals by allowing his gut plate to eat people on the battlefield. The last one really worth talking about. They have a couple that are essentially just either we don't know where they came from, or they were pieces of Sky Titan technology or castles that the ogres literally just took and they attached it, like tied it onto a piece of tree or something and used it as a club. And all of those are horrifically effective, which that's how we get like the Siege Breaker and the Thunder Mace. The Siege Breaker, we actually don't know where it came from. But the Thunder Mace is literally just the foundation stone of a sky castle bound to a big Mornwood tree with like a bunch of iron and stuff. And that thing, if it's like hits the ground, it causes a hilariously big shockwave that will just if you're just like a regular human being, it will annihilate you if you're standing anywhere remotely near it, because it just basically causes a horrifying shockwave, you know, like a thunderclap, but right next to you. And that huge shockwave can just kill people very easily. But probably the most interesting one and kind of the most terrifying one is an actually fairly unexplained magic item known as the Greedy Fist. The Greedy Fist is a sentient magic item that has kind of god tier powers. And the way that it works is when ogres fight a challenge, usually all of their equipment might be like piled up somewhere, or maybe if there's been a succession of challenges or they're having like a big feast or something, somewhere around them there will essentially be a pile of scrap, like metal stuff. And what'll happen is that if a notably mighty challenge is fought, especially between like tyrants or something, then out of this pile, magically, it's not because it was there, it'll like assemble itself within the pile, a sentient fist, an iron fist. So it's like which an iron fist is like a bladed gauntlet that ogres wear, that ogres uses like shields, especially Rhinox riders, or not, sorry, Mournfang riders. And they're literally like full gloves that are these big old hunkin' metal gloves that have like a bunch of bladed parts, and they're very nasty. But the Greedy Fist will literally crawl. Have you ever seen the Addams Family, like the the disembodied hand? But it will crawl out to the victor of the challenger and basically crawl up his arm and assemble itself around one of his fists. And it's a exceptionally scary magic item that, and I can't remember, it might stay with him till he dies, but I don't think it does. I think it only stays with him for a little while. But the Greedy Fist is super spooky because it can literally show up just about anywhere. Like, you never know when it's gonna pop up. It just kind of does. Yeah. And, yeah, not only that, it, you can claim it for a time. So, it won't stay with you forever, but it'll stay with you for a bit. And it kind of, like, embeds itself into your hand. Eventually, it'll leave, but it's an exceptionally scary item, and it just seems to wander from, like, chosen to chosen to chosen, which is pretty terrifying, especially at how effective it is at getting people killed, like killing enemies. Solomonski, saw your question. We've already answered that. Thanks so much. Legend of Cretacia. If an ogre ate a plague monk on the battlefield, would he die, or would his stomach acid be strong enough that he would survive any kind of disease like that? He'd probably be fine. Ogres have, and I'll kind of answer this as all plague-related questions. Ogres have gotten away with eating literal demons of Nurgle, which are way worse than anything that you're going to see from a living member of Clan Pestilence. Sometimes, you know, the Skaven or Nurgle follower in question might be infected with something truly heinous that, if eaten, is just way worse than it would be normally, and that could infect and kill an ogre in question. It's rare, but it can happen. And ogres aren't immune to disease, you know, like Clan Pestilence diseases are good against them, but generally when it comes to eating, they can get away with it. That being said, ogres can be smart enough to usually, like, roast rat before they eat it. Not always, but I would say that it would have to be a truly devastating disease in order for it to have a chance to infect and kill an ogre. Most of the time, he's probably going to be fine, or he might get sick for a little bit, like an upset stomach. But to kill him, it would have to be something pretty serious, like Lord Skrulk or something. That being said, there are things like used by those factions that would definitely kill an ogre if they tried to consume it. You know, for instance, the Scathe of Clan Pestilence, a unit I really want to see put in the game at some point. It's called the Cauldron of 1,000 Poxes, which is like a super tier unit for Clan Pestilence, and it's literally just like a giant cauldron full of this disease soup, for lack of a better term. If an ogre were to take a bite of that, he's dead. Like, not even, not even a contest. Then we've got questions from No Peace Just War, Dr. Bright, and Ronald Clark. We already answered all those. Thanks, my dudes. We're going to be getting more and more of those as we near the end here. Dis90 Rich. Could an ogre Firebelly attend the Imperial Colleges of Magic if he agreed not to eat anyone? No, probably not. The ogres use a much different form of magic than most of the scholars of the Empire use. I would say any of the scholars of the Empire use. The ogres are much more akin to priests or chaos sorcerers or shamans than they are to the wizards of the civilized nations. It's quite likely that the ogre Firebelly's concept of how magic and sorcery works would clash very heavily with the scholars there. Because you have to remember that traditional wizards, and even the likes of like the really powerful chaos sorcerers, a lot of those guys are very learned. Like, they study magic. They read tomes and they practice, and it's a science to them. Like, obviously there are things that they have to be careful about, like when they're manipulating the winds and all that, but they have a very fundamental understanding of how magic works, like where it comes from, how to manipulate it. It's an academic study. Firebellies, to them, fire magic is just the favor of the fire mouth. And that's it. Like, it's literally just they have made their god happy and they're going to go out there and burp fire on people or like throw fireballs and stuff. They're manipulating, they act much more like priests than they do wizards. But because their gods are there is a slight difference between like the priests of the Empire, for instance, and the wizards of the Empire. There's a lot of difference there with how those abilities manifest. But for ogres, there is no difference. Worship and magic, priests, wizard, it's all the same to them. To them, there is no difference. Arcane the Everchosen, already answered that. Thanks so much. Batcow123. Do, other than man-eaters, ogres ever travel outside or settle outside the Mountains of Morn? Also, is there any ogre settlement around... Okay, we already answered the first part, but so this one we haven't answered. Is there any ogre settlement around the Great Maw itself? Some kind of religious site? No. The area around the Great Maw is far too deadly and dangerous for anything other than some like truly horrifying monstrosities to remain for an extended period of time. Even all these thousands of years later, it has stayed essentially an irradiated hellscape dominated by extreme weather and creatures that it would be difficult to figure out if they are actual living creatures or just like manifestations of chaos where there's just so much like insane dark magic in the area that they can manifest. Ogres who make a pilgrimage to the Great Maw know that for a not insignificant amount of them, it's a one-way journey. Because there's a lot of dangers, but and the thing about it is they know to stay longer than strictly necessary to observe the Maw and like make some kind of offering is suicide. You cannot stay there very long. It's way too dangerous. However, the last settlement on the road to the Great Maw is a rundown trading post known as Shambletown, which is run primarily by vast amounts of Gnoblars and exiled ogres who have nowhere else to go. And it's a very sad, dilapidated place. And it's kind of right on the edge of where the Mountains of Morn meet the ancient giant lands. And it's the last bastion, the last moat of civilization you're going to see on that journey to the Great Maw. And the creatures that live there are desperate, to say the least. And, you know, they sell all kinds of stupid trinkets. You know, you have all the ogres and the Gnoblars there selling, like, you know how in our world you can go to some places where they'll be like trying to sell you like the toe of some kind of weird saint, or like they're like, oh, I've got some threads here which are from the fabric that the burial shroud Jesus was buried in, or I have a hair that's been passed down from this famous prophet, and you know, all this stupid crap. That's basically what Shambletown is, and it's not a great place. That being said, I really hope it's on the campaign map for Total War. And then the last question we're going to do today is from Waw360. Do elves and dwarves employ ogre man-eaters? Yes, though much less often than humanity. Here, I actually have a fun story for you. I know just where it is. I have a fun excerpt about a time where the Wood Elves hired ogres, which I'm sure you're all thinking, Wood Elves? Why would the Wood Elves hire ogres? So allow me to read this story verbatim for you, because it's one of my favorite stories involving Ogre Kingdoms, because it's just so silly. Nashrak. Rockjaw's Feast. So this happened, this happened like 20 years before the start of the end times. So very recent. This was like, yeah, this was very, very recent. It says, the ogre braggart Rackjaw and his Stonegut mercenaries crossed the Grey Mountains and into Athel Loren. Instead of slaughtering the brutes, the Wood Elves welcomed them. After the ogres had been plied with all kinds of wondrous meats and countless flagons of fairy wine, they departed the forest unmolested, though there was a brief moment of danger when one of the ogres attempted to consume a live unicorn. Thoroughly sozzled and stupefied, the ogres didn't realize that the paths on which they left took them not towards the Empire, as they had intended, but into the heart of a Skaven warren on the edge of Paravon. This they obliterated in short and drunken order. When the battle was done, an elf maid appeared to Rockjaw and presented him with wondrous riches, the agreed price, she said, for the battle just conducted. Rockjaw couldn't remember agreeing to fight any battle, but he took the gold anyway. Thereafter, he swore to never enter Athel Loren again. So, yeah. And there are a couple other famous anecdotes across the world. You know, for the dwarves, they've hired ogres from time to time, especially when they're desperate or like their backs are up against the wall. Ungrim Ironfist very famously hired... Ungrim Ironfist and Belagar Ironhammer both very famously hired Goldfag Maneater, though obviously that didn't work out. And even like the Dark Elves, they have a place called the Dark Tower, which I want to say is along the northern border, which has a bunch of ogres as its bodyguards, because they were all captured by Dark Elf slavers, and the Dark Elves were so impressed by their ruthlessness and drive to survive that they gave them jobs instead of, you know, making them slaves, because ogres would make terrible slaves because they're big and scary. Unless you're Chaos Dwarves. Chaos Dwarves have ogre slaves. But in any event, hopefully that will answer all the questions for today. Hopefully we'll be kind of pumping these out. Today's the last day for the contest, so might be a little busy going into tomorrow, but at least on Monday we should be back to something normal. In any event, hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Take care of yourselves out there. Stay safe, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.